Forget everything you think you know about the Middle Ages. Close your eyes and picture a medieval woman. What do you see? A helpless damsel locked in a stone tower, waiting for a knight? A weary peasant treading through mud, silent and invisible? A queen, powerful in name, but a mere pawn in a game of kings? It's a lie. A 1,000-year-old illusion designed by Victorian historians who wanted to paint the past as a man's world. The truth is far grittier, far more complex, and infinitely more lucrative. If you could step into the smoke-filled streets of 14th century London, Paris, or Florence, you wouldn't just hear the clanking of swords. You'd hear the clinking of gold coins held in the calloused, capable hands of women. These weren't just wives or daughters. They were the hidden architects of the European economy. They were the Brewsters who controlled the thirst of entire cities. They were the silk women who dressed royalty. They were the money lenders who held the debts of the very knights who supposedly protected them. In this definitive investigation, we are stripping away the veil of history. We are uncovering the secret bank accounts, the cutthroat business tactics, and the legal loopholes that allowed women to build empires in an age of iron and faith. This isn't just a history lesson. This is a masterclass in survival, ambition, and the pursuit of cold, hard cash. To understand how these women became rich, we first have to understand the chaos of the time. The transition from the dark agrarian ages to the rise of the great medieval cities was a gold rush. As trade routes opened from the east and the Black Death reshaped the labor market, a vacuum was created. And where there is a vacuum, there is opportunity. Men were often away at war, on crusade, or lost at sea. This left the city gates wide open for a new breed of entrepreneur. While the church preached that a woman's place was in the home, the reality of the marketplace told a different story. In the bustling markets of the Low Countries and the artisan quarters of Germany, women were negotiating contracts, suing their competitors in court, and dominating specific industries so completely that men weren't even allowed to enter. In the medieval world, if you wanted to make money, you had to belong to a guild. These were the gatekeepers of industry, the tech giants of the 1300s. While many think these were boys' clubs, the ledgers tell a different tale. Women weren't just helpers. In cities like Cologne, there were entire guilds comprised exclusively of women: gold spinners, silk weavers, and master embroiderers. These women didn't just work. They owned the means of production. They owned the shops. They trained the apprentices, and they set the prices that the nobility had to pay. But how did they do it? How did they navigate a legal system that supposedly treated them as property? The answer lies in a tiny, overlooked phrase in medieval law that changed everything: Femme Sole. This legal status was the ultimate golden ticket, allowing a woman to act as a man in the eyes of the law, to sign her own name, keep her own profits, and answer to no one. But before we dive into the legal genius of the Femme Sole, we must look at the most dangerous, most widespread, and most profitable industry of all, one that every man, woman, and child in Europe relied on daily. An industry that women controlled with an iron fist until the moment it became too profitable for men to ignore. I'm talking, of course, about the ale, but the rise of the alewife wasn't just about brewing a drink, it was about a secret monopoly that fueled the building of cathedrals and the funding of wars. And as we're about to see, when women control the beer, they control the city. In the year 1350, you didn't drink for pleasure. You drank for survival. The concept of pure water was a fantasy. In the growing urban centers of Europe, The local rivers were the city's sewers, dumping grounds for tanneries, and final resting places for livestock. If you drank from the Thames or the Seine, you were essentially inviting a death sentence from cholera or dysentery. This made ale the most essential commodity in the Western world. It was the liquid bread that fueled the labor of the peasant, the prayers of the monk, and the battles of the knight. Because the brewing process required boiling, it killed the bacteria that made water lethal. It was calorie-dense, packed with B vitamins, and provided the physical energy needed to build cathedrals. And for nearly 5 centuries, the gatekeepers of this essential fuel were almost exclusively women. They were known as brewsters or alewives. To understand the sheer scale of this industry, we must look at the medieval kitchen. Brewing was a grueling, dangerous, and highly technical process that fit perfectly into the intermittent nature of female labor. While men were tied to the plow or the guild workshop for fixed hours, women managed the rhythm of the home. The process began long before the first drop was poured. A brewster had to be a master of biology and meteorology. She had to malt her own grain, usually barley, oats, or rye, soaking it in water, and then spreading it out on the floor to germinate. She had to sense the exact moment when the starch turned to sugar, then kiln dry it over a smoky fire without burning the house down. Then came the mash. Dragging heavy cauldrons of water to the fire, the brewster would mix the malted grain, stirring for hours with a heavy wooden oar. This wasn't light work. It was backbreaking labor. She had to maintain a precise temperature without a thermometer, using only the steam's color and the bubble's size as her guide. If she failed, the entire batch her family's investment for the month would turn to vinegar. Once the ale was fermented, the brewster became a marketing executive. In a world where 95% of the population couldn't read, visual branding was everything. This is where we see the birth of the ale-stakey. Imagine a long timber pole, often 7 feet long, thrust out of a second-story window over the muddy street. At the end of it hung a bush, a bundle of ivy, evergreen, or straw. This was the universal signal. The ale is ready. If the bush was fresh, the ale was new. If the bush was withered, you were drinking the dregs. But the marketing didn't stop there. The alewife herself was the brand. She would don a tall, felt, pointed hat not out of fashion, but for utility. In a crowded medieval marketplace teeming with thousands of people, that hat acted like a lighthouse. A thirsty laborer could look across the square, see the tip of a pointed hat, and know exactly where to find his next pint. Because ale was so essential, it was the most regulated substance in history. Every town had an assize of bread and ale, a set of laws that dictated exactly how much a gallon of ale should cost based on the current price of grain. To enforce this, the town appointed ale tasters. These were men who would literally go from house to house, tasting the brew. Legends say they wore leather breeches and would pour a bit of ale on a wooden bench, then sit on it. If their pants stuck to the bench when they stood up, the ale had too much unfermented sugar and was unfit. But here is where the corruption and the female-led shadow economy began. The records of the manorial courts are filled with the names of women. In the town of Brigstock, England, between 1300 and 1348, over 300 women were fined for breaking the assize. Did they care? No. They viewed these fines as a licensing fee. The profit margins on a successful batch were so high that paying a 3-penny fine to the court was just another cost of doing business. These women were the original disruptors. They manipulated the quality, watered down the dregs for the poor, and reserved the strong ale for the wealthy who could pay in silver. They were running a sophisticated, tiered pricing model hundreds of years before modern economics. The alewife's home was not just a shop, it was the third place of the medieval world. In an era where houses were cramped, dark, and cold, the alewife's parlor, warmed by the brewing fire and smelling of malt, was the only community center available. She was the keeper of secrets. Because men from all walks of life gathered in her home, the alewife was often the best informed person in the village. She knew which farmer was failing, which knight was in debt, and which merchant was planning to move his wool to a different port. In many cases, the alewife acted as an unofficial banker, extending credit to her regular customers. "Drink now, pay at harvest," was the slogan that kept the medieval economy moving. This credit system gave women an immense invisible leverage over the male population. The beginning of the end for the brewster came in the form of a tiny green flower, hops. Before hops, ale went sour within days. It had to be brewed locally and consumed immediately. This localism protected the women's monopoly. But hops acted as a preservative. Suddenly, beer, ale with hops, could be stored for months and shipped across oceans. This shifted brewing from a cottage industry to industrial manufacturing. Industrialization required capital money for massive vats, large warehouses, and international shipping fleets, and in the 15th century, women were legally barred from taking out large commercial loans or owning large-scale industrial property. Men saw the gold mine. They formed the Worshipful Company of Brewers. They began a systematic campaign to criminalize the independent alewife. They passed laws stating that brewing was now a science that required a formal apprenticeship that was closed to women. To truly kill the competition, the newly formed male guilds didn't just use law, they used propaganda. They took the symbols of the alewife's success and twisted them into symbols of evil. The tall hat, now the mark of a servant of Satan. The cauldron, now used for brewing poisons instead of ale. The cat, kept to protect grain from rats, now a familiar or a demon in disguise. The alstaki, now a broomstick for flying to the Sabbath. By the end of the 1500s, the independent brewster had been transformed in the public imagination. She was no longer a pillar of the community. She was a threat to the soul. This was one of the most successful brand sabotages in human history. Men stole the industry, and they used the fear of the supernatural to ensure women could never take it back. But as the doors of the brewery slammed shut, the women of the towns didn't just sit in the dark. They took their capital, their secret networks, and their Femme Sole status, and moved into a market that was even more exclusive, even more expensive, and far more dangerous. The high-stakes world of international silk and the underground black markets. As the scent of fermented malt and damp taverns fades into the background, we move from the rough streets of the working class into the gilded chambers of the elite. But don't be fooled by the softness of the surroundings. In the medieval world, luxury wasn't just about comfort, it was a weapon of status, and its most powerful ammunition was silk. While men were forging steel in the heat of the smithy, women were building a different kind of empire. An empire made of threads so fine they were invisible to the naked eye, yet strong enough to bind the finances of kingdoms. This was the world of the silkwomen. In the 14th and 15th centuries, if you were a nobleman in London, a merchant in Paris, or a clergyman in Cologne, and you wanted to show the world your wealth, you didn't go to a man. You went to a woman. Because in the world of high-end textiles, women didn't just participate, they held a total, legally protected monopoly. To understand the sheer economic weight of this industry, we have to look at Paris. In the 13th century Livre des Métiers, or Book of Trades, we find something staggering. Out of the hundreds of guilds listed, 5 were mixed, men and women, but several were entirely female. The filatrices de soie, silk spinners, and the ouvrières de tissu de soie, silk weavers, were organizations run by women, for women. They had their own female jurés, or overseers who inspected the quality of the work, managed the treasury, and represented the guild before the king's officials. Think about the implications. In a society often characterized as patriarchal, these women had their own corporate structure. They decided who could enter the trade, how much they were paid, and they could sue any one man or woman who tried to sell substandard silk on their turf. They weren't just workers. They were the regulators of a multi-million-dollar luxury market. But it was in London where the silk woman reached her peak of political and economic influence. Unlike the brewers we discussed earlier, the silk women of London weren't usually poor widows looking for a side hustle. They were the wives and daughters of the city's elite, the mercers and the goldsmiths, who used their family connections to build their own independent fortunes. A London silk woman was a sophisticated merchant. She imported raw silk from Italy through the Mediterranean trade routes, often negotiating with Genoese and Venetian traders. She didn't just sew. She managed a complex supply chain. She oversaw workshops filled with female apprentices and journeywomen who lived under her roof. These women produced the most expensive items in the medieval world: silk ribbons, laces, corses, heavy silk girdles, and the incredibly intricate gold thread used in ecclesiastical vestments. One small silk girdle could cost more than a master mason earned in an entire year, and every penny of that profit, by custom and often by law, belonged to the woman who sold it. Why was this a female monopoly? Was it just tradition? No, it was a matter of extreme technical skill. The processing of silk in the Middle Ages was a nightmare of precision. Raw silk arrived in tangled skeins that had to be thrown or twisted into usable thread. This required a level of manual dexterity and patience that the medieval world categorized as women's work, a categorization the silk women used to their advantage. They guarded their techniques like state secrets. The throwing process, the exact ratio of gold leaf to silk core in making cypress gold thread, the secret recipes for vibrant diasthes were passed down from mistress to apprentice through oral tradition. Men tried to enter the trade, but they lacked the specialized training. By the time a man could learn the craft, the silk women had already lobbied the government to keep him out. In the year 1455, the silk women of London did something extraordinary. They felt their profits were being threatened by Lombard, Italian merchants, who were importing finished silk goods, bypassing the local workshops. Most history books say women had no political voice in the 15th century. Tell that to the silk women. They organized a massive, collective petition to Parliament. They didn't ask. They demanded protection. They argued that their trade supported young gentlewomen and provided a respectable livelihood for thousands of women in the city. They used the rhetoric of national interest to get what they wanted, and they won. Parliament passed the Silk Women's Act, which banned the importation of foreign silk ribbons and laces for 5 years. This was one of the earliest examples of protectionist trade policy in English history, and it was engineered entirely by women. They proved that they weren't just masters of the needle, but masters of the lobby. How rich were they? Let's look at the records of the Great Wardrobe, the royal department responsible for the king's clothing. In the late 1400s, women like Alice Claver and Elizabeth Stocker were the primary suppliers to the courts of Edward IV and Richard III. Their invoices were astronomical. Alice Claver's accounts show her selling thousands of pounds worth of silk and gold fringe to the king. But here's the kicker. When the king ran out of money, which happened often, he didn't always go to the male bankers of the city. He went to his silkwomen. Records show these women extending massive lines of credit to the English crown. They were essentially the king's private financiers, using their silk profits to hold the sovereign in their debt. Imagine the scene. A king of England, a man who supposedly answers only to God, sitting in a room with a woman in a silk gown, negotiating the interest rates on a loan that will fund his next war. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was the reality of the London marketplace. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the silk trade was the environment it created. These weren't factory floors in the modern sense, they were domestic workshops. A master silkwoman's house was a female-centric fortress. In an age where women were expected to be under the coverture of a husband, these workshops were often independent spaces. Apprentices were bound to the mistress, not her husband. The mistress was responsible for their education, their food, and their moral guidance. In these houses, women shared trade secrets, political gossip, and business strategies. They were the incubators of female economic thought. They were learning how to read contracts, how to weigh gold, and how to spot a fraudulent Italian merchant from a mile away. Like the alewives, the silkwomen's reign eventually faced a threat they couldn't petition away: technology. The invention of the silk throwing mill, massive, water-powered machine, allowed for the mass production of silk thread. These machines required large-scale capital and were almost always owned by male-dominated corporations. But the silkwomen didn't vanish overnight. They transitioned. They used their accumulated wealth to move into the one area where no machine could ever compete, the area that defined the very essence of legal and financial freedom in the Middle Ages. Because while a woman could be a merchant and a woman could be a brewer, there was one specific legal status that turned a woman into a legal ghost, a person who could do everything a man could do without ever needing a husband's permission. To find out how they hacked the legal system to become Femme Sole, we have to look at the courtrooms where the real fortunes were defended. Imagine for a moment that you are a person who does not exist in the eyes of the law. This was the reality for the vast majority of married women in the medieval world, under a doctrine known as coverture. When a woman married, her legal identity was literally swallowed by her husband. She became a femme couverte, a covered woman. She could not own property. She could not sign a contract. She could not sue someone in court. And she certainly could not run a business in her own name. To the law, she was a ghost, a shadow walking behind the man who represented her soul and her silver. But as cities grew and the smell of profit began to outweigh the strictures of tradition, a crack appeared in this iron wall. A legal loophole was born that would change the course of economic history. This was the status of the Femme Sole. In its simplest sense, Femme Sole meant a woman alone. Traditionally, this applied to widows or women who had never married. These women were legal anomalies. Because they had no husband to cover them, the law was forced to recognize them as independent entities. They could hold land, they could trade, and they could be held responsible for their own debts. But the real revolution happened when this status was extended to married women who wanted to enter the marketplace. This was known as the custom of the Femme Sole merchant. In the great trading hubs like London, Bristol, and York, the city fathers realized that the economy would grind to a halt if a merchant's wife was legally paralyzed every time her husband left for a trade fair in Flanders or a crusade in the Holy Land. So they created a legal fiction. If a woman stood in a public marketplace or a city court and declared herself a femme sole merchant, she was essentially performing a legal magic trick. For the purposes of business, she was no longer a wife. She was an independent economic actor. She could rent her own shop, buy her own raw materials, and hire her own apprentices. Crucially, if she went bankrupt, the law could not touch her husband's assets. And if the husband went bankrupt, his creditors could not seize her business. It was the earliest form of limited liability, a shield of gold and parchment that allowed women to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval capitalism. But do not think this was a gift from a benevolent patriarchy. It was an economic necessity born of cold, hard reality. The medieval world was a world of high mortality and constant absence. Men died of plagues, they were captured in wars, or they were simply away at sea for years at a time. If the business died with the man's absence, the city lost tax revenue. The status of femme sole was a pragmatic solution to keep the money flowing, and once women had this legal key, they used it to unlock doors that no one expected them to open. They became more than just substitutes for their husbands. They became his rivals and his superiors. Let us look at the power of the signature. In a world where a man's word was his bond, a woman's signature on a parchment deed was a revolutionary act. Under the protection of femme sole status, we see women in the records of the Mayor's Court of London acting with a ferocity that would make a modern CEO blush. Take the case of a woman named Juliana Koch. She wasn't just a seller of small goods. She was a major player in the London grain market. When a male supplier failed to deliver a shipment of barley on time, she didn't wait for her husband to come home and handle it. She marched into court, filed a lawsuit, and demanded damages for lost profits. She knew the law better than the men she was suing. She understood the intricacies of contract law, the importance of witnesses, and the power of the written record. This legal autonomy created a new kind of social class, the professional widow. In the medieval mindset, a widow was supposed to be a figure of pity, someone who would quickly remarry to find a new protector. But the bank ledgers tell a different story. For many women, widowhood was not a tragedy. It was a promotion. It was the moment they finally attained full femme sole status, without the lingering shadow of a husband's potential interference. We see records of wealthy widows in Paris and Ghent who refused to remarry for decades. Why would they? If they remarried, they would lose control of their fortunes. They would become femme couvert once again, handing their keys and their cash boxes over to a new master. Instead, they chose to remain alone, managing vast estates, running international export firms, and acting as matriarchs of their neighborhoods. They became the unofficial bankers of the medieval city. Because they held the status of femme sole, they were the only women who could legally lend money and collect interest. We find evidence of women in the 14th century who held the mortgages of local knights. Imagine the power dynamic in that room. A knight, a man of violence and high birth, having to bow his head and negotiate repayment terms with a woman in a velvet gown who held the parchment to his ancestral lands. She was protected by the very laws that were designed to keep her out, using the loophole of her singleness to exert control over the aristocracy. But the status of femme sole was a double-edged sword. While it gave women the right to profit, it also gave them the right to fail. A Femme Sole merchant could be sued. She could be cast into debtor's prison. She could be pilloried in the market square for selling shoddy goods. The law did not coddle her. It treated her with the same cold indifference it showed to men. And in many ways, that indifference was the greatest form of equality she could ask for. It was a recognition that her brain was as sharp as any man's, her ambition as vast, and her responsibility as absolute. The mastery of the legal system was perhaps the most impressive skill these women possessed. They weren't just merchants, they were amateur lawyers. They understood that the law was a flexible thing, a tapestry that could be rewoven if you knew where to pull the threads. They used the custom of burgage tenure to ensure they could inherit property. They used jointures to protect their dowries from their husbands' gambling debts. They were constantly negotiating their position, moving between the roles of wife, widow, and merchant, with the grace of a chess player. However, as the Middle Ages drew to a close, and the centralized power of the state began to grow, these local customs and legal loopholes came under fire. The rise of the common law in England and the codification of Roman law on the continent began to tighten the noose around the Femme Sole. The men who wrote the new laws were more interested in order and male hierarchy than in the messy, vibrant economic freedom of the medieval town. They saw the independent woman as a threat to the stability of the family and the state. They began to argue that the status of Femme Sole merchant was an aberration, a relic of a chaotic past that needed to be corrected. But they could never fully erase what these women had built. The records remain. The petitions to Parliament, the court cases, the property deeds, and the thousands of signatures of women who refused to be ghosts. They proved that gender is not an economic barrier when the law provides even a tiny opening. They proved that when a woman is given the legal right to her own name, she will use it to build a world. But the story doesn't end in the courtroom. Legal status is just the armor. The real battle was fought in the counting houses and on the docks of the great ports. Because once a woman had the legal right to trade, she didn't just stay in her local village. She looked toward the horizon. She looked at the great ships coming in from the Mediterranean and the Baltic Sea. She saw the international trade in wool, wine, and spice, and she decided that she wanted a piece of the world itself. Next, we must look at the women who took the ultimate risk. The women who didn't just sell in the market, but who became the titans of international shipping. These were the merchants of Venice and London, the women who managed global supply chains before the word even existed, and who navigated the dangerous waters of international diplomacy to ensure their ships came home full of gold. If the courtroom was the armor that protected a woman's right to exist, then the great ports of Europe were the arenas where that existence was transformed into legendary wealth. We often think of the medieval merchant as a man in a fur-lined robe, standing on the docks of London or Venice, counting his crates of wool and spices. But look closer at the parchment manifests of the great trading galleys, and you will find names that history tried to smudge out. Names like Alice de Brienne, Margaret Seeley, and the formidable women of the Hanseatic League. These were not just shopkeepers. They were the titans of international logistics, women who understood that in the 15th century, the greatest profits were found where the salt air met the horizon. To understand the scale of their ambition, you have to understand the commodity that built the medieval world: wool. In the late Middle Ages, English wool was the gold of the North. It was the highest quality in existence, demanded by the luxury looms of Flanders and the high-fashion houses of Florence. And the trade in this wool was a high-stakes game of international diplomacy and dangerous transport. This was the world of the merchants of the staple. While many of these merchants were men, their wives and widows were the silent partners who often managed the most complex part of the business, the export. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare of moving a massive shipment of wool in the year 1420. You had to coordinate with shearers in the Cotswolds, arrange for pack horses to bring the heavy sacks to the London docks, negotiate with the royal customs officials for the king's export tax, and then secure space on a cog or a galley bound for the port of Calais. We have records of women managing every single link in this chain. They weren't just sitting in offices. They were on the wharves, checking the quality of the fleece, arguing with ship captains about freight rates, and ensuring that their mark, the unique brand burned into the side of the wool sack, was recognized in the counting houses of Europe. But the wool trade was only half of the story. While English women sent the raw materials out, a sophisticated network of female importers brought the world back in. This was the luxury trade, the realm of spices, dyes, and exotic fabrics. In the great Mediterranean hub of Venice, the Serenissima, the laws of trade were rigid, yet women found ways to weave themselves into the very fabric of global commerce. They invested in the commenda, a form of early venture capital. A woman would provide the funds for a trading voyage to the Levant or the Black Sea, and in return, she would take a massive share of the profits. She took the risk of the sea, the risk of piracy, and the risk of war, all for the chance to turn her silver into an empire. The risks were staggering. In an era before modern communication, once a ship dipped below the horizon, it was effectively in another world. It could be lost to a sudden gale in the Bay of Biscay, seized by French privateers, or held for ransom by Mediterranean pirates. This is where the medieval businesswoman showed her true grit. When a ship went missing, she didn't just weep, she went to war. We see records of female merchants in London and Bristol filing international lawsuits against foreign governments for the illegal seizure of their cargo. They understood the lex maritima, the international law of the sea, as well as any admiral. They petitioned the king to grant them letters of marque, which essentially gave them the legal right to hire their own privateers to go out and seize the goods of the country that had robbed them. This was a world of eye for an eye economics, and these women played for keeps. Beyond the physical goods, these women were masters of the most advanced technology of the time, the bill of exchange. This was the medieval version of a wire transfer. Instead of carrying heavy, dangerous chests of gold across bandit-ridden roads, a merchant would carry a piece of papyra promise to pay. To use these documents effectively, a woman had to understand complex exchange rates between the pound sterling, the florin, and the ducat. She had to have a network of trusted agents in foreign cities who would honor her signature. We see women in the 14th century managing these paper fortunes with a level of mathematical precision that was supposed to be beyond their gender. They were trading not just in wool or wine, but in credit, time, and trust. Perhaps the most fascinating examples are the women who managed the trade with the Hanseatic League, the powerful confederation of merchant guilds that controlled the Baltic Sea. The Hansa was notoriously patriarchal, yet in cities like Lübeck and Danzig, we find women who were members in all but name. They managed the export of timber, fur, and salted fish, the raw essentials of medieval life. When their husbands died, these women didn't sell the business. They took the helm. They negotiated with the Teutonic Knights, navigated the shifting alliances of northern kings, and maintained their family's place in one of the most exclusive trade networks in history. These women also understood the power of the social capital of trade. In the medieval world, business was personal. You traded with people you knew, or people your family knew. The female merchants were the keepers of these international lineages. They arranged marriages between the great merchant houses of different cities, effectively creating a web of familial alliances that spanned the continent. A merchant's wife in London might spend her life corresponding with her cousins in Bruges or her business partners in Bordeaux. This wasn't just small talk. It was the intelligence-gathering network of the medieval world. They knew which ports were under blockade, which harvests were failing, and which kings were on the verge of bankruptcy. But there was a darker, more secretive side to this international wealth. For every official merchant house, there was a shadow. For every taxed sack of wool that left the London docks, there were barrels of contraband hidden in the basements of coastal inns. For every legally imported silk gown, there were hundreds of yards of fabric smuggled past the king's eyes. As the state began to tighten its grip on international trade, the most ambitious women didn't just play by the rules, they learned how to break them. They realized that the greatest profits didn't come from the light of the official marketplace, but from the gray zones of the underground economy. In the next chapter, we will leave the salt-sprayed docks and the official counting houses behind. We are going into the shadows of the medieval city, into the world of the black market, the pawn shops, and the illegal trade rings. We will discover how women used their invisibility to run the most profitable and the most dangerous underground businesses in Europe. From the illegal brewing of small beer to the high-stakes world of money laundering and stolen goods, we will see how women turned the shame of the underworld into a fortune that no king could touch. To the official eye of the medieval state, the economy was a clean, ordered machine of guilds, taxes, and royal charters. But if you step away from the sunlit wharves and the grand guild halls, and slip into the narrow, overhanging alleys where the sun rarely touches the cobblestones, you find the dark matter of the medieval world. This was the underground economy, a sprawling, chaotic, and incredibly lucrative shadow world that didn't appear in the king's ledgers, but kept the pulse of the city beating. And in this realm of shadows, women were the undisputed masters. Their perceived invisibility in the formal political structure became their greatest tactical advantage. While the law looked for men to tax and regulate, women were busy running the black markets that fueled the survival of the urban poor and the greed of the urban elite. The most common form of this shadow trade was a practice the authorities called forestalling and regrading. In modern terms, this was the original high-stakes flipping of commodities. Imagine a cold morning in 14th century Paris or London. Before the sun has even risen, and long before the official city markets are legally allowed to open, a network of women known as huckstresses already miles outside the city gates. They are intercepting the farmers coming in from the countryside. They buy up entire cartloads of eggs, butter, poultry, and grain with cold, hard cash right there on the road. By the time the official market bell rings, these women have cornered the supply. They then retreat back into the city, hiding the goods in cellars and back rooms, only to release them slowly throughout the day at a massive markup. They were the original market manipulators, creating artificial scarcities to drive up prices, and the city officials were powerless to stop them because these transactions happened in the gray zones where the law couldn't reach. But the underground economy wasn't just about food. It was about the poor man's bank, the world of illegal pawnbroking. In a time before credit cards or small business loans, if a laborer's family hit a streak of bad luck, they had nowhere to go but the local godmother, or auntie. These were women who operated clandestine pawn shops out of their kitchens. They would take a copper kettle, a wool cloak, or even a wedding ring as collateral for a high-interest loan. This was a dangerous business. Lending money for interest was technically the sin of usury, and running an unlicensed pawn shop could land a woman in the pillory. Yet, the records of the ecclesiastical courts are overflowing with cases of women who were essentially running neighborhood microfinance empires. They knew the exact value of every household item in the district, and they used that knowledge to build a revolving fund of silver that made them the most powerful figures in the slums. They held the life savings and the survival of their neighbors in their locked chests, and that gave them a level of social control that no male magistrate could ever hope to achieve. Then, there was the world of the fence, the professional receiver of stolen goods. In the dense, crowded tenements of a medieval city, theft was a daily occurrence. But a stolen silver chalice or a bolt of fine velvet is useless if you can't sell it. This is where the female underground network became indispensable. Women were the primary processors of stolen luxury items. They had the skills to pick apart the embroidery of a stolen gown and re-sew it into a different fashion, making it unrecognizable to its original owner. They could melt down silver plate in small domestic fires, turning recognizable heirlooms into anonymous bullion. Because women were often the ones responsible for the domestic labor of the city, serving as laundresses, cleaners, and hucksters, they could move through the houses of the wealthy and the stalls of the poor without raising a single eyebrow. They were the perfect couriers, hiding illicit wealth in the folds of their oversized aprons or in the bottom of a basket of dirty laundry. We also have to look at the persistence of the shadow brewery. As we saw earlier, men eventually seized the official hopped beer industry through the guilds, but they couldn't stop the small ale trade. In the backcourts and hidden cellars of every major city, women continued to brew traditional, unhopped ale in secret. This was the moonshine of the Middle Ages. It wasn't taxed, it wasn't inspected by the ale tasters, and it was significantly cheaper than the guild-sanctioned beer. These women were running what we would today call speakeasies. They provided a space for the disenfranchised to gather, drink, and gamble away from the prying eyes of the city watch. It was a high-risk, high-reward enterprise. If caught, their equipment would be smashed, and they would be banned from the city. But the demand for cheap, home-brewed ale was so insatiable that for many women, the risk was simply a cost of doing business. The underground was also a place of chemical innovation, though perhaps not the kind we would celebrate today. In the pursuit of profit, women in the food trade became masters of adulteration. If you were a woman selling flour in a dark corner of the market, and you wanted to stretch your profit margin, you learned exactly how much fine white sawdust or chalk could be mixed in without changing the color too much. If you were selling wine, you knew which herbs could hide the scent of vinegar, or how to stretch a barrel of expensive vintage with cheap, sour dregs. The city records are full of scolds and shrews who were punished for selling underweight bread or corrupt meat. But look past the moralizing language of the male judges, and you see women who were conducting sophisticated experiments in cost-cutting and product survival. They were fighting for every half-penny in a world that wanted to keep them in poverty, and they used every trick of the trade to ensure their families ate, even if the rest of the city suffered for it. Perhaps the most sophisticated part of the female underground was the management of social vice. While the church and the state took a hard line on gambling and prostitution, the reality was that these industries were massive economic drivers, and they were often managed by women at the top of the hierarchy. The madams of the medieval world were more than just keepers of brothels. They were property managers, fashion moguls, and protectors. They negotiated with city officials for protection. They invested their profits in legitimate real estate, and they managed complex networks of service workers. They operated in the ultimate gray zone, tolerated by the authorities because they provided a necessary service, yet legally excluded from the protections of the guild. This required a level of diplomatic skill and psychological warfare that was unmatched in the legitimate world. They had to be part lawyer, part general, and part confessor. As we look at these criminal activities, we have to ask, why did they do it? The answer is simple. The official system was rigged against them. The guilds were closed, the taxes were high, and the legal status of women was precarious. The black market was the only place where a woman's ambition wasn't capped by her gender. In the shadows, a woman wasn't a wife or a daughter. She was a player. She was someone who could command a room, manipulate a price, and build a fortune that was entirely hers. These women were the pioneers of the informal economy, the ancestors of the modern street vendor and the underground entrepreneur. They proved that even when you are pushed to the very edges of society, the human drive to trade, to profit, and to survive will always find a way. But as these women grew wealthier in the shadows, their influence began to leak back into the light. The silver they earned in the illegal pawn shops and the forestalled grain markets didn't stay in the cellars. It was used to buy respectability. It was used to fund the education of sons, to provide dowries for daughters, and most importantly, it was used to enter the most high-stakes, most gentlemanly business of all, the world of formal finance. Because once you have enough cash, the line between an illegal moneylender and a respectable financier becomes very, very thin. Next, we are moving out of the alleys and into the counting houses of the elite. We are going to look at the women who took their underground profits and transformed themselves into the primary lenders to the nobility, the church, and the state. These were the money lenders and the financiers, the women who held the keys to the kingdom's vaults, and who realized that the most powerful thing you can own isn't a bolt of silk or a barrel of ale, but another person's debt. The clinking of coins in a dark alleyway is a sound of survival, but the scratch of a quill on a parchment ledger in a quiet, sunlit counting house, that is the sound of true power. As we move from the chaotic underground markets into the upper echelons of medieval society, the nature of wealth changes. It is no longer about who can sell the most ale or who can weave the finest silk. It is about who owns the debt of the men who run the world. In the High Middle Ages, money was scarce. Credit was the lifeblood of the economy, and women were the primary, yet often invisible heart of the financial system. They realized that while a merchant sells a product once, a moneylender sells the same gold over and over again through the magic of interest. To understand how women became the primary financiers of the medieval elite, we have to understand the massive paradox of the church. The medieval world was obsessed with the sin of usury, the charging of interest on a loan. To the theologians, time belonged to God, and charging someone for the use of money over time was akin to stealing from the Almighty. But the reality of trade required capital. You cannot build a cathedral, fund a war, or stock a ship for the Levant without a massive infusion of cash up front. This created a massive, hypocritical vacuum in the economy. And into this vacuum stepped the women of the towns, armed with their dowries, their inheritances, and a legal genius for finding loopholes in the laws of God and man. If you were a knight in 14th century England or a minor noble in France, your wealth was tied up in land you couldn't easily sell without losing your status. But you needed liquid cash for armor, for horses, or to pay the king's ever-increasing taxes. Where did you go? Often you went to the widow of the manor or the mercer's wife in the nearest city. Because women were often the survivors of the medieval world, outliving multiple husbands and accumulating the accumulated capital of 3 or 4 different families, they were the ones sitting on the largest piles of liquid silver. They weren't just lenders. They were the venture capitalists of the 1300s. They didn't always call it interest. They were too smart for that. They masked their profits through a variety of clever legal fictions. They would lend £100 and record the debt as 120, claiming the extra 20 was a gift for their trouble. Or they would use a system called the rent charge, where the borrower would essentially pay a rent on their own land to the lender until the debt was cleared. In the eyes of the law, it was property management. In reality, it was a high-interest mortgage. We see records in the Court of Common Pleas showing women managing hundreds of these contracts simultaneously. They were the original bankers, using the complexity of the law to hide the simplicity of their profit. The scale of this lending was staggering. We have the account books of women like Lady Alice de Brienne or the legendary Silk Women of London, which show them extending lines of credit to the highest members of the aristocracy. When the Earl of Derby or the Duke of Gloucester needed to fund a feast or a small private army, they didn't just go to the great banking houses of Italy. Those houses were often overextended and prone to spectacular collapses. Instead, they went to the safe money, the wealthy urban widows who operated with lower overhead and a much deeper knowledge of the local landscape. These women were the stability in a volatile market. They weren't interested in the glory of the crusade. They were interested in the security of the collateral, and the collateral was the key. This is how the economic map of Europe was actually redrawn. When a knight failed to pay back his loan to a townswoman, she didn't just shrug her shoulders, she foreclosed. We see hundreds of instances where former aristocratic lands, manor houses and mills passed into the hands of urban women through debt defaults. This was a massive, slow-motion transfer of wealth from the old, blood-stained nobility to the new, coin-strapped urban merchant class. A woman who started her life as the daughter of a simple wool stapler could end her life as the owner of 3 manors and a castle, simply by being a more disciplined accountant than the men who borrowed from her. But it wasn't just the elite. There was a secondary, much broader layer of finance managed by women that touched every single person in the medieval town. This was the world of the godmother of credit. In every parish, there was usually 1 or 2 women who acted as the community's unofficial bank. If a young apprentice wanted to buy his freedom and start his own shop, he went to her. If a family needed to pay for a wedding or a funeral, they went to her. She operated on a system of social credit. She didn't need a formal contract written in Latin. She knew your father, she knew where you lived, and she knew exactly how much your reputation was worth. This hyper-local lending was the grease that kept the wheels of small-town industry turning. Without these women, the middle class of the Middle Ages simply would not have existed. They provided the seed money for the very businesses that would eventually challenge the feudal system. We also have to acknowledge the unique and often tragic role of Jewish women in this financial landscape. Because Jewish communities were often excluded from owning land or joining the craft guilds, they were forced into the world of finance, which the Christian world simultaneously demanded and reviled. Jewish women were often the primary managers of these family banks. In the records of the English Exchequer, we see names like Lycorecia of Oxford, a woman so wealthy and powerful that she dealt directly with King Henry III. She managed a massive portfolio of loans across the kingdom, negotiating with bishops and barons alike. Her story, and the stories of women like her, remind us that finance was often the only arena where a woman's intellect was allowed to operate at its full, lethal capacity. As these women accumulated wealth through debt, they became a political force that the state could no longer ignore. When a king needed to raise an army, he couldn't just tax the poor. There wasn't enough to take. He had to borrow from the people who had the cash. This gave the female financiers of the towns a seat at the table of power. They could demand trade concessions, they could petition for new city charters, and they could protect their industries in exchange for forgiving a portion of the royal debt. They were the ones who realized that the greatest form of power isn't a sword, it's the ability to say no to a king when he asks for his next loan. This era of female-led finance created a new kind of woman, the independent matriarch. She was someone who spent her days reviewing ledgers, calculating exchange rates, and meeting with lawyers. She was the one who decided which businesses in her town would thrive and which would wither away. She was the architect of her own freedom, using the very thing the church called a sin to build a life of luxury and influence. She proved that in the end, the most important trade in the Middle Ages wasn't the trade in wool or wine, it was the trade in time and trust. But while some women were building empires of silver in the counting houses, another group of women was building a different kind of economic powerhouse. They were doing it behind high stone walls, under the guise of piety and prayer. Because if you wanted to see the most sophisticated corporate structure, the most advanced agricultural techniques, and the most stable business models of the medieval world, you didn't go to the market. You went to the convent. The business of faith was perhaps the most successful female-run enterprise in human history, and its reach extended from the vineyard to the library and into the very souls of the population. Next, we must enter the cloisters to see how the nuns of industry turned the vow of poverty into a multi-million-dollar business empire that dominated the production of wine, medicine, and the most valuable commodity of all, the written word. When we think of a medieval nun, we often imagine a woman in a quiet stone cell, head bowed in perpetual prayer, isolated from the dirty, chaotic world of commerce. We think of the vow of poverty as a complete rejection of wealth. But if you look at the tax records and the land deeds of the 13th and 14th centuries, you will see a very different picture. The medieval convent was not just a house of God. It was one of the most sophisticated, stable, and powerful corporate structures in human history. These were the first multinational corporations managed entirely by women, for women. While a townswoman had to navigate the complex laws of marriage and the whims of male-dominated guilds, a nun operated within a sovereign economic entity. Behind the high walls of the cloister, women were running massive agricultural estates, dominating the production of high-value goods and managing a spiritual economy that held the purse strings of the entire population. To understand the business of faith, you first have to understand the power of land. In the Middle Ages, land was the only true form of permanent wealth. While a merchant's ship could sink and a lender's coins could be stolen, land remained. Convents were some of the largest landowners in Europe. Through centuries of noble daughters entering the Vale and bringing massive spiritual dowries of acreage, and through the deathbed bequests of wealthy lords, looking to buy their way into heaven, these institutions accumulated vast territories. A powerful abbess was essentially a CEO of a massive real estate portfolio. She managed thousands of tenant farmers, oversaw the collection of rents, and navigated the complex manorial courts to protect her borders. Unlike a secular noble who might lose his land to war or poor management, a convent's land was held in mortmain, the dead hand of the church, meaning it was legally protected and theoretically eternal. This gave female religious houses an economic stability that no male merchant could ever match. But they didn't just sit on the land, they turned it into a production powerhouse. If you wanted the highest quality wool, the most refined wine, or the most potent herbal medicines in Europe, you didn't look to the secular world. You looked to the monasteries and convents. The Cistercian and Benedictine orders, in particular, were masters of agricultural technology. They pioneered new irrigation techniques, developed superior strains of livestock, and created the first standardized production lines for commodities. In Germany and France, nunneries were the primary producers of commercial-grade wine. They didn't just make it for the altar. They sold it by the barrel to the growing cities and the royal courts. They understood the value of branding long before the modern era. A wine produced by a specific respected convent could command a price significantly higher than a generic vintage because it carried the seal of the cross, a medieval guarantee of quality and purity. This leads us to perhaps the most valuable product of the medieval world, the written word. Before the printing press, knowledge was the ultimate luxury item. A single illuminated manuscript could cost as much as a small farm. While history often highlights the monks in their scriptoriums, the nuns of the pen were equally prolific and often more skilled in the delicate art of illumination. Convents were the primary hubs of the knowledge economy. They were the publishers, the librarians, and the researchers of their age. They produced Bibles, prayer books, and legal documents not just for their own use, but as high-end commissions for the nobility. This was a labor-intensive, high-margin industry. The management of a scriptorium required a deep understanding of supply chain sourcing expensive vellum from calfskins, precious pigments like lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and pure gold leaf from the merchants we discussed earlier. The abbess who managed this production was essentially running a high-end design house, catering to the most exclusive clientele in the world. But the real genius of the religious economic model was the spiritual economy. This was the medieval version of the insurance industry. The central fear of every medieval person, from the beggar to the king, was the time they would spend in purgatoria, place of cleansing fire, where souls suffered before entering heaven. The only way to shorten this time was through the prayers of the living. This created a massive market for intercessory prayer. Wealthy families would establish chantries endowments of money or land specifically designed to pay for nuns to pray for their souls in perpetuity. This was a brilliant business model. The raw material was prayer, which cost nothing but time, and the customer was willing to pay a premium for a service that guaranteed their eternal comfort. It was a recurring revenue stream that lasted for generations. Large nunneries would have dozens of these contracts running simultaneously, creating a financial foundation that funded their massive building projects and their charitable works. Speaking of charity, we must look at the social infrastructure provided by these women. In a world without state-funded welfare, the convents were the primary providers of social services. They were the hospitals, the orphanages, and the hotels of the Middle Ages. But don't think of this as purely selfless work. These services were integrated into their economic model. A convent that operated a high-end guest house for traveling nobility was essentially running a 5-star hotel. They charged for the food, the lodging, and the stabling of horses. Because they were religious houses, they were often exempt from the taxes that secular innkeepers had to pay, giving them a massive competitive advantage. Furthermore, as providers of medical care, they were the primary pharmacists of the age. They managed extensive physic gardens where they grew medicinal herbs. They developed secret recipes for salves, tinctures, and tonics that they sold to the public. They were the biotech firms of the 1300s, turning the business of healing into a significant source of income. However, the most radical thing about the convent was what it did for female autonomy. Inside the cloister, a woman could reach the very top of the hierarchy. An abbess held the rank of a baron. She had the right to coin her own money, to hold her own courts, and in some cases, she even had the power to appoint male priests to parishes. She sat at the table with bishops and kings, not as a wife or a daughter, but as a peer. She was a leader of an independent female community that managed its own treasury, its own defense, and its own future. For an ambitious woman in the Middle Ages, the veil wasn't a prison. It was a career path. It was the only place where she could exercise her intellect and her organizational skills without the interference of a husband. But even this massive empire of faith wasn't immune to the shifting tides of the late Middle Ages. As we move into the 15th century, the rise of the secular state and the growing criticism of the church's wealth began to put pressure on the convents. People began to ask why brides of Christ were living in such luxury and managing such vast estates. The tension between the vow of poverty and the reality of their corporate power was becoming a political lightning rod. Yet, even as the formal power of the church began to waver, the individual economic spirit of women was finding a new, more personal expression. While the nuns were managing estates from behind stone walls, another group of women was taking over the very heart of the growing cities. These weren't corporate leaders or financiers. They were the urban landladies. They realized that as more and more people flooded into the cities looking for work, the most valuable thing you could own wasn't a vineyard or a scriptorium, it was a roof. They turned the domestic space itself into a machine for generating cash. Next, we are leaving the quiet cloisters and moving back into the crowded high-rent districts of the medieval city. We are going to look at the women who dominated the real estate market, from the grand houses of the elite to the subdivided tenements of the poor. We will see how women used their control over the home to become the primary landlords of the urban revolution, proving that even in a man's city, a woman often held the keys to the door. As we leave the quiet, echoing cloisters of the convent and step back into the chaotic, mud-splattered streets of the late medieval city, we encounter a new form of power. It is not the power of the soul or the power of the trade guild, but the power of the key. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the cities of Europe were exploding. London, Paris, Ghent, and Florence were bursting at the seams as peasants fled the feudal countryside in search of urban freedom. Space became the most precious commodity in existence. And in this vertical revolution of timber and stone, women emerged as the primary gatekeepers of the urban home. We often imagine the medieval landlord as a wealthy lord or a powerful abbot, but the tax registers and the rent rolls of the era tell a different story. They reveal a vast, influential class of urban landladies who owned, managed, and subdivided the very roof over the city's head. To understand how women came to dominate the real estate market, we have to look at the unique laws of the city, specifically a concept known as burgage tenure. Unlike the countryside, where land was often tied up in complex military service obligations, city property was much more like modern real estate. It could be bought, sold, and most importantly, inherited by women. When a merchant or a craftsman died, his widow didn't just inherit his business. She inherited his house. Under the law of dower, a widow was entitled to at least 1/3 of her husband's property for the rest of her life. In many cities, this right was even stronger, giving her the entire family home. These women suddenly found themselves in possession of massive, multi-story buildings in the high-rent districts of the city center. And they realized very quickly that they didn't need to live in all that space themselves. They could turn their surplus square footage into a machine for generating passive income. The medieval urban house was a marvel of efficient, if cramped, design. These were not the sprawling manors of the countryside. They were narrow, tall buildings that leaned over the streets, often reaching 4 or 5 stories high. A savvy landlady would live in the comfortable middle floor, but she would subdivide the rest. The ground floor, with its access to the street, would be rented out as a shop or a workshop to a young craftsman starting his career. The top floors, drafty and cramped, would be partitioned into tiny rooms for laborers, students, or single women working in the silk and ale trades we discussed earlier. This was the birth of the apartment complex. The landlady was the original property manager, navigating the complexities of multi-tenant buildings centuries before the invention of the modern lease. But being a landlady was far more than just collecting coins at the end of the month. It was a high-stakes job that required a deep understanding of structural engineering, social diplomacy, and the brutal reality of the city courts. Medieval houses were made of wood, lath, and plaster. They were fire traps, and they were constantly rotting in the damp European climate. A successful landlady had to manage constant repairs. She had to hire carpenters, tilers, and daubers. She had to negotiate with the city officials about the maintenance of the gutters and the disposal of waste. If a chimney caught fire or a wall collapsed into the street, it was her neck on the line. We see records of women being sued in the London Assize of Nuisance for everything from blocked drains to encroaching on a neighbor's light. These women were active, litigious, and fierce defenders of their property rights. They understood that every inch of their building was an asset, and they fought for those inches in the courtrooms of the Guildhall with the tenacity of soldiers. The relationship between a landlady and her tenants was a complex social contract that defined the medieval neighborhood. In an era without a formal police force, the landlady was the primary arbiter of order within her walls. She was responsible for the moral conduct of her tenants. If a room was being used for illegal gambling or unlicensed brewing, the authorities held the landlady accountable. This gave these women an immense amount of social leverage. They could decide who was respectable enough to live in their district. They acted as a filter for the community, vetting new arrivals and keeping a watchful eye on the movement of people and goods. In many ways, the urban landlady was the informal sheriff of her block. She knew everyone's business because everyone lived under her roof. She held the keys, both literally and figuratively, to social acceptance in the city. We also have to look at the high end of this market, the managed lodging houses and the great urban inns. Many of the most successful women in the property market weren't just renting out spare rooms. They were running sophisticated hospitality businesses. These inns were the grand hotels of the 15th century, catering to wealthy merchants, traveling clerics, and even minor nobility. Running a major inn like the Tabard in Southwark or the Crown in Oxford was a massive undertaking. It required the management of a large staff of servants, the procurement of massive quantities of food and drink, and the ability to provide security for the guests and their horses. The landlady of a great inn was a public figure, a woman of reputation and substance who moved comfortably among the elite. She was a master of logistics, ensuring that her guests were fed, her linens were clean, and her stables were secure, all while maintaining a profit margin that would allow her to expand her holdings. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the female-dominated rental market was the world of the single-room tenement. For the poor and the marginalized of the medieval city, these landladies were their only lifeline to a roof. We see evidence of women specializing in low-income housing, buying up dilapidated properties in the suburbs and turning them into warrens of small, affordable rooms. While modern history might label some of these women as slumlords, the reality is more nuanced. They were providing the essential infrastructure for the working class. They offered flexible, short-term housing for a population that was constantly on the move. They accepted payment in kind, a piece of fabric, a day's labor, or a copper kettle when the rent couldn't be met in silver. They were the shock absorbers of the medieval economy, managing the volatility of the urban poor through a mixture of iron-fisted collection and communal mercy. The financial independence this provided cannot be overstated. A woman with a steady stream of rental income was a woman who did not need a husband to survive. She was a femme sole in the truest sense of the word, even if she was married. We find records of married women holding property separately from their husbands, using the rental income to fund their own investments or to provide for their children from previous marriages. They were building multi-generational wealth. A landlady would often leave her properties to her daughters, creating a matrilineal line of ownership that lasted for decades. This created a class of independent women who were rooted in the geography of the city, women who owned the very ground they walked on, and who used that ownership to project power into every corner of urban life. But as the 15th century drew to a close, the nature of urban property began to change. The rise of the great merchant companies and the professionalization of the law began to squeeze out the independent, small-scale landlady. Real estate started to become a game of large-scale capital and institutional investment. The informal, personal contracts of the neighborhood were replaced by rigid, standardized leases written by male lawyers. The social power of the landlady, based on her personal knowledge of her tenants, was eroded by the growing bureaucracy of the state. Yet, the legacy of these women remains etched into the very layout of our modern cities. The subdivided houses, the managed tenements, and the concept of urban hospitality all found their roots in the ambitions of these medieval women who realized that the most stable way to get rich was to own the space where other people lived, worked, and dreamed. However, as the control of the physical home became more regulated, some women moved their business into a realm that was even harder for the state to control, the realm of the body and the mind. Because while the city could tax your house and regulate your shop, it struggled to govern what happened in the dark corners where science met superstition. As we look at the evolution of the female economy, we must acknowledge the women who made their money by navigating the ran gyoi mong man between life and death. They were the healers, the midwives, and the herbalists who turned the knowledge of nature into a profitable, if dangerous, career. They were the keepers of the medical underground, women whose skills were in high demand by everyone from the queen to the commoner, but whose success would eventually lead them to a deadly confrontation with a rising male medical establishment that viewed their knowledge as a threat to be extinguished. Next, we must look at the women who managed the Ran Gyoi Mongman between health and heresy. We will explore the world of the medical underground, where women turned the business of birth and the science of herbs into a fortune, only to find themselves labeled as something much more sinister when their profits became too large to ignore. In the medieval world, the distance between the cradle and the grave was often no more than a few inches of cold steel or a single bad harvest. Life was fragile, and in a society where the official medical establishment was reserved for the ultra-elite and focused more on the alignment of the stars than the reality of the human body, the common people turned to a different kind of expert. They turned to the women of the medical underground. For centuries, women had been the primary practitioners of medicine, surgery, and pharmacology. They were the keepers of the collective knowledge of survival. But this wasn't just a communal service. It was a highly specialized, highly profitable, and eventually, a highly dangerous business. These women were the pioneers of the life and death trade, managing the most intimate moments of the human experience for cold, hard cash. To understand the economics of the medical underground, we must first look at the figure of the midwife. In the 14th century, birth was the most dangerous thing a woman could do, and it was a moment where men were strictly, legally, and culturally forbidden from entering the room. This gave midwives a total, protected monopoly over the most essential event in human society. A master midwife was a high-status professional. She didn't just help with the delivery. She was a surgeon, a pharmacist, and a legal witness. Her fees were substantial, often tiered based on the wealth of the family. For the birth of a royal heir or a noble son, a midwife could be paid in gold, granted a lifetime pension, or given title to land. But even in the towns, the midwife was a woman of substance. She was often the only person in the community who knew the medical secrets of the elite who was using contraceptives, who had suffered a botched abortion, and who the true father of a child really was. This knowledge was a form of information capital that she could, and often did, leverage to maintain her social and economic position. Beyond the birthroom, the wise woman, or the hedge doctor, operated a sophisticated pharmaceutical business out of her kitchen. In a world where university-trained doctors were rare and expensive, these women were the primary apothecaries for 90% of the population. They managed extensive physic gardens, growing everything from common mint to the deadly nightshade and the hallucinogenic mandrake. They understood the chemistry of nature. They knew that honey was an antiseptic, that willow bark could dull pain, and that ergata fungus found on rye could be used to control bleeding after childbirth. They didn't just sell herbs, they sold cures. They packaged their knowledge into tonics, salves, and elixirs that were sold in the markets and at the city gates. This was a high-margin industry. The raw materials were often free, gathered from the woods or grown in a backyard, but the secret recipe was what commanded the price. These women were the original inventors of intellectual property in medicine. But the medical underground also had a darker, more lucrative side: the death trade. Women were the primary caretakers of the dying and the dead. They managed the leper houses. They served as nurses during the horrific waves of the Black Death, and they were the ones responsible for laying out the dead. This was a grim business, but in a world obsessed with the ritual of a good death, it was essential. Women were paid to wash the bodies, to sew the shrouds, and to prepare the herbs and spices used in embalming. During the plague years, When men fled the cities in terror, these women stayed behind. They became the primary executors of the estates of the dead, often inheriting the belongings and the properties of those who had no one else left. They were the scavengers and the survivors of the apocalypse, turning the tragedy of the masses into a grim, silent fortune. However, as the 15th century progressed, the success of the female medical practitioner began to attract a deadly kind of attention. The newly formed male medical colleges in Paris, London, and Bologna were looking to professionalize medicine, which, in the medieval mind, meant making it a university subject that required the knowledge of Latin and the exclusion of women. These male doctors were threatened by the wise women for a very simple reason. The women were better at it. While the male doctors were still arguing about the four humors and refusing to touch their patients, the female healers were actually setting bones, cleaning wounds, and using effective herbal remedies. The women were more successful, they were cheaper, and they had the trust of the community. It was a classic case of professional jealousy, escalating into a gendered hostile takeover. To break the female monopoly, the male establishment turned to the ultimate weapon of the age, the charge of maleficium or witchcraft. They began to argue that if a woman could heal without a university degree, she must be doing it through a pact with the devil. The wise woman was rebranded as the witch. Her cauldron, which for centuries had brewed life-saving medicines, was now said to be brewing poisons and charms. Her knowledge of contraception and abortion was used as proof of her hatred for life. The church and the state joined forces with the male doctors to pass laws that banned women from practicing medicine under the threat of execution. In the city of Paris, the case of Jacoba Felicier in 1322 became a landmark. Despite testimonies from her patients that she had cured them when all the male doctors had failed, she was banned from practicing because she lacked the formal training. It was an economic assassination disguised as a legal proceeding. But the medical underground didn't vanish. It simply went deeper. Women continued to trade in secrets and cures behind closed doors. They turned their beauty products, creams for the skin, dyes for the hair, and perfumes into a secondary market that male doctors found too trivial to regulate, but which remained incredibly profitable. They continued to serve as the underground midwives for the poor, operating in the shadows where the law was too afraid to tread. They proved that you can ban a person, but you cannot ban a necessity. The demand for female care was so deeply rooted in the human psyche that the business of the body remained a female stronghold long after the official history books said it had been conquered by men. As we look at the ruins of this female medical empire, we see the beginning of a shift. The control over life and death was becoming too public, too dangerous to manage in the urban center. Many ambitious women began to realize that the real wealth was moving back to the land, not as a peasant, but as a manager. They saw that while the city was a place of regulation and trial, the vast rural estates of Europe were places of untapped economic potential. They saw that while the men were away at war, the great houses of the countryside were being run by a new breed of woman who combined the financial genius of the merchant with the logistical iron will of a general. Next, we are leaving the smoke and the shadows of the medical underground and heading into the sprawling green empires of the rural powerhouses. We are going to look at the women who managed the massive agricultural estates of the nobility while their husbands were off on crusades or fighting the 100 Years' War. These were the women who turned the manor house into a factory, who commanded armies of laborers, and who realized that in the end, the most powerful thing you can control isn't a secret cure or a silk loom, it's the food supply of a nation. While the city was a place of frantic trade and fleeting trends, the medieval countryside was a game of deep strategy and long-term survival. We often carry a romanticized image of the noblewoman in her manor house, sitting by a window, embroidering a tapestry, while she waits for her husband to return from the glory of the 100 Years' War or the religious fervor of a crusade. But the reality recorded in the dusty manorial rolls and the frantic letters of the era reveals a much more grueling truth. When the gates of the castle slammed shut and the lord rode away with his knights, the manor house didn't become a place of quiet waiting. It became a high-pressure corporate headquarters. The lady of the manor was not a decorative figurehead. She was the chief operating officer of a sprawling agricultural empire. She was the woman who managed the food supply of the nation, the woman who commanded a small army of laborers, and the woman who ensured that while the men were destroying the world, the home front remained profitable and secure. To understand the scale of a rural powerhouse, you have to understand the manor as a self-sustaining corporation. In the 14th century, a large estate was more than just a house. It was a complex network of farms, mills, forests, and villages. The lady was responsible for the home farm, the land kept specifically for the manor's use, but she also oversaw the labor obligations of hundreds of peasant tenants. This was a masterclass in supply chain management. Every season brought a new logistical nightmare. In the spring, she had to ensure the seeds were sown in the correct rotation: wheat, barley, and fallow to keep the soil fertile. In the summer, she managed the shearing of thousands of sheep, the wool that would eventually fuel the international trade we discussed earlier. In the fall, she was the general in the War of the Harvest, coordinating the labor of every man, woman, and child in the district to get the grain into the barns before the rains arrived. If she failed, the consequence wasn't a drop in stock price. It was the starvation of her family and her people. The most vital tool in her arsenal was the account roll. We have found thousands of these parchments, written in a mix of Latin and Norman French, which show that these women were obsessive bookkeepers. They tracked everything. They knew exactly how many bushels of oats were fed to the horses, how many eggs the hens laid each week, and exactly how much silver was earned from the sale of surplus cheese at the local market. They were masters of marginal profit. They realized that the real wealth wasn't in the grand gestures of war, but in the tiny details of domestic production. A savvy lady would invest in a new water mill or a more efficient bread oven, knowing that these infrastructure projects would pay for themselves in increased rent and efficiency within a few years. She was managing a diversified portfolio of assets: land, livestock, and laborand. She did it with a level of financial discipline that her husband, often busy spending money on armor and ransoms, could never hope to achieve. But she wasn't just a manager. She was the law. One of the most significant powers of the lady of the manor was her role in the manorial court. When her husband was absent, she was the presiding judge over the local population. Imagine a woman sitting at the high table in the great hall, surrounded by her bailiffs and clerks. Before her stood peasants accused of letting their cows graze in the wrong field, or neighbors involved in a dispute over a boundary fence. She had the power to levy fines, to settle land disputes, and to punish crimes. This was HR and legal mediation combined into one. She had to be fair enough to prevent a peasant revolt, but firm enough to ensure the manor's income was protected. This required a deep knowledge of customary law, the unwritten rules of the village that had existed for centuries. She was the guardian of the social order, and her ability to maintain peace in the countryside was the only thing that allowed the kingdom to function while the men were away. we also have to look at her role as a wartime commander. The 100 Years' War wasn't just fought on the battlefields of Agincourt or Crécy. It was fought in the backyard of every manor in France and England. When marauding bands of soldiers or rival lords approached, it was the lady who directed the defense. She managed the armory, she ensured the walls were repaired, and she organized the stockpiling of food and water for a potential siege. We have the letters of women like Margaret Paston in England, who wrote to her husband not about romance, but about the need for more crossbows, more gunpowder, and more men to defend their property from a hostile neighbor. These women were not damsels in distress. They were battlefield tacticians who understood that their property was their life, and they were prepared to fight for every stone of it. But the rural powerhouse was also an innovator, because they were responsible for the health and productivity of their livestock. These women were at the forefront of medieval agri-tech. They experimented with crossbreeding sheep to produce the fine wool the silkwomen demanded. They managed the complex dairies, a female-dominated industry that produced the butter and cheese that fed the growing cities. The dairymaid was the worker, but the lady was the manager who understood that the quality of the grass in the pasture determined the price of the cheese in London. She was essentially running a high-end food processing plant. They also managed the manorial forests, which were the primary source of fuel and timber. The lady had to decide which trees could be cut for construction and which had to be preserved for the future, the earliest form of sustainable resource management. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this role was the diplomatic economy. A noblewoman in the countryside was a node in a massive network of elite families. She spent her days writing letters, negotiating marriages for her children, and maintaining alliances with other manor houses. This wasn't just social climbing. It was a way of securing her family's financial future. A well-placed marriage could bring a new manor into the estate, or settle a century-old debt. These women were the mergers and acquisitions experts of the medieval world. They understood that in a society where land was power, a strategic alliance was the most effective way to expand their corporate reach. They were the ones who kept the genealogies, who knew who was related to whom, and who used that information to navigate the dangerous waters of courtly politics. However, the weight of this responsibility was immense. The lady of the manor was often isolated, surrounded by people who depended on her for their survival, but who also might resent her power. She had to be a doctor to her servants, a judge to her tenants, a mother to her children, and a CEO to her estate. This constant pressure created a class of women who were incredibly resilient, intellectually sharp, and fiercely independent. They proved that the domestic sphere was not a place of escape, but a place of intense productivity. They showed that the economy of the kingdom didn't just happen in the marketplace or the counting house. It happened in the barns, the mills, and the fields of the rural manor. As the 15th century progressed and the feudal system began to break down, the role of the rural powerhouse changed. The rise of a money-based economy meant that labor was no longer an obligation, but something to be bought and sold. The lady had to become a landlord in the modern sense, navigating a world of cash rents and wage labor. But her experience as a manager of complex systems prepared her for this transition better than many men. She had always known that the real power was in the management of resources. And as the wealth of the countryside flowed into the cities, it began to fuel a new kind of obsession. The silver earned from the sale of wool and the collection of rents was no longer just being saved in oak chests. It was being spent on the most visible form of power in the medieval world, It was being spent on the image of the self. The wealthy women of the towns and the countryside began to use their fortunes to dominate a market that was as much about psychology as it was about thread. They moved into the world of fashion as currency, realizing that in a world of shifting status, how you looked was the ultimate indicator of how much you were worth. Next, we are moving away from the muddy fields and the account rolls to the world of the high-end atelier and the royal court. We are going to look at how women used fashion not just as clothing, but as a strategic investment. We will see how they manipulated sumptuary laws, controlled the textile markets, and used the visual language of wealth to cement their place at the very top of the social hierarchy. These were the women who understood that in the end, a silk gown wasn't just a garment, it was a statement of credit, a shield of status, and a currency all its own. In the mud-choked streets and stone-paved markets of the late Middle Ages, your identity was not something you kept in a wallet or a digital profile. It was something you wore on your back. In a society where most people were illiterate and social hierarchy was seen as a divine mandate, appearance was the only resume that mattered. But for the ambitious townswomen we have been following, fashion was far more than vanity. It was a strategic investment, a sophisticated language of credit, and most importantly, a form of high liquidity currency. In an age where physical coins were often scarce and banking systems were still in their infancy, a silk gown, a velvet hood, or a silver girdle functioned as a wearable bank account. These women realized that in a world of shifting status, the image of wealth was the most effective tool for generating actual wealth. To understand the economics of medieval fashion, we first have to look at the sheer, staggering cost of textiles. In the 14th century, a high-quality wool cloak could cost as much as a laborer earned in 6 months. A silk gown embroidered with gold thread was worth more than a small house. Because these items were so valuable, they were treated with the same reverence we might treat a bar of gold today. They were listed in every single probate inventory and every will with obsessive detail. A woman wouldn't just leave her daughter her clothes. She would specify the exact color, the type of lining, the weight of the silver buttons, and the origin of the dye. These garments were durable assets that retained their value for decades. They were often used as collateral for loans or given as part of a dowry to secure a business merger between merchant families. If you were short on cash to pay a tax or buy a shipment of grain, you didn't go to a bank. You went to a pawnbroker and handed over your best kirtle. This brings us to the fascinating and often misunderstood world of sumptuary laws. As the merchant class in cities like London, Paris, and Venice grew wealthier, they began to dress like the nobility. This terrified the old aristocracy. They saw the new money townswomen wearing the same furs, the same deep crimsons, and the same long-tailed sleeves that were traditionally reserved for those of noble blood. To maintain the social order, kings and parliaments passed a series of laws that dictated exactly what you could wear based on your income and your social rank. These laws were specifically targeted at women because women were the primary consumers and displays of family wealth. The law might say that a merchant's wife could not wear ermine fur, or that she couldn't use more than a certain amount of silver in her embroidery. But for the medieval townswoman, breaking these laws was a business necessity. If you were a female merchant or a landlady looking to attract high-end clients, you couldn't afford to look like a peasant. You had to look like someone who had credit, someone who was successful, and someone who moved in the right circles. These women became masters of the fashion loophole. They would use prohibited fabrics in the linings of their clothes, where they were technically hidden, but could still be seen when they walked. They would invent new styles of headgear that used massive amounts of expensive linen or silk, but didn't technically violate the rules about gowns. They were in a constant cat-and-mouse game with the city authorities, viewing the occasional fine for excessive dress as a small marketing expense compared to the prestige it brought them. The colors a woman wore were also a direct indicator of her economic reach. Dyes in the Middle Ages were expensive and difficult to produce. To wear a vibrant, deep scarlet or a rich violet was to tell the world that you had access to the global trade networks. Scarlet required the crushed bodies of thousands of Kermes insects imported from the Mediterranean. Blue required woad from France, or the incredibly expensive lapis lazuli from the East. When a townswoman walked through the market in a brightly colored gown, she was advertising her family's trade connections and her own ability to navigate the complex world of international shipping. She was a walking billboard for her business. We also have to look at the secondary market for fashion. Because clothes were so valuable, there was a massive industry in used garments. The fripperers, or second-hand clothes dealers, were often women who bought, repaired, and resold the wardrobes of the elite. This was the original recycling economy. A silk dress might start its life on the back of a duchess, be sold to a wealthy merchant's wife, then be cut down into a hood for a tradeswoman, and finally end up as a set of silk ribbons on a servant's cap. Every stage of this life cycle involved a financial transaction. Women were the primary brokers in this market, understanding the exact resale value of every scrap of fabric and every silver pin. They were the ones who knew how to turn old luxury into new capital. Jewelry and accessories functioned as the high-denomination currency of the female world. A gold girdle or a heavy silver chain was not just an ornament, it was an emergency fund. These items were designed to be portable and easily hidden. If a woman had to flee a city during an outbreak of the plague or a riot, she couldn't carry her furniture or her barrels of ale, but she could wear her fortune. We see records of women using their jewelry to pay ransoms for captured husbands, to fund lawsuits, or to provide the seed money for a new business venture. The goldsmith's wife was often a partner in her husband's trade, and she would wear her inventory on her person, acting as a walking vault for the family's most precious assets. Furthermore, fashion was the primary way women expressed their individuality and their ambition in a world that often tried to suppress it. The way a woman pinned her veil or the specific pattern she chose for her embroidery were subtle signals of her taste, her education, and her professional status. The silk women we discussed earlier were the fashion designers of their age, creating trends that moved from the city streets up to the royal court. They understood that the new was always more valuable than the old, and they manipulated the cycle of fashion to ensure a constant demand for their high-end products. They were the original influencers, using their own appearance to drive the sales of their workshops. By the end of the 15th century, the economics of appearance had become so sophisticated that it started to blend into the world of professional service and hospitality. The way you dressed wasn't just about showing off your own wealth, it was about the experience you provided to others. The wealthy landladies and the owners of great urban inns realized that their personal appearance and the appearance of their staff were part of the brand of their establishment. They began to use fashion to create an atmosphere of luxury and reliability that attracted the most profitable clients. As we move forward, we are going to look at how this focus on appearance and the management of domestic space transformed into the first professional service industry, we are going to explore the world of the service and hospitality moguls, the women who ran the grand hotels and the elite restaurants of the medieval world. They realized that once you have the silk, the silver, and the real estate, the final frontier of profit was the management of people's comfort. They turned the act of serving food and providing a bed into a high-margin, professionalized business that allowed them to dominate the social life of the city. Next, we are leaving the ateliers and the dressing rooms behind and heading into the bustling, aromatic world of the great urban kitchens and the high-end guest houses. We will see how women used their traditional domestic skills to build a service empire, managing hundreds of employees and catering to the most powerful people in the world, proving that in the end, the most valuable thing you can sell is the feeling of being home, even when you are far from it. As we move from the vibrant and symbolic world of fashion into the steaming, aromatic heart of the medieval city, we find the final and perhaps most enduring empire built by women. This is the realm of service and hospitality. While the merchants traded in wool and the silkwomen in luxury, the women of the hospitality industry traded in the most fundamental human needs: food, shelter, and security. In the 15th century, as the population of Europe became more mobile and the wheels of international commerce turned faster, the informal hospitality of the past was no longer enough. The world needed professional spaces where a merchant from Venice could feel safe in London, and where a traveling cleric could find a bed that wasn't infested with vermin. Into this gap stepped the great female innkeepers and the mistresses of the urban guest houses. They took the traditional skills of the domestic hearth and scaled them into a sophisticated, high-margin service industry that defined the social and economic life of the urban center. To understand the scale of this business, we must first distinguish between the common tavern and the professional inn. A tavern was a place for drinking, often small and chaotic, but a professional inn, like the legendary establishments in Southwark or the university towns of Oxford and Paris, was a massive corporate entity. It was the medieval equivalent of a 5-star hotel. These buildings were often the largest secular structures in the city, centered around a wide courtyard where heavy wagons and fine carriages could be secured. Managing such a space was a logistical nightmare that required the iron will of a general and the financial precision of a banker. Because women were the traditional managers of the household, they were the ones who possessed the organizational DNA to run these complex systems. An innkeeper wasn't just a cook. She was a facility manager, a security chief, and a human resources director. The physical infrastructure of a great inn was a testament to the landlady's investment. She had to manage multiple sleeping chambers, often subdivided by social rank. While the poor might sleep on straw in a communal hall, the wealthy expected private rooms with lockable doors, fireplaces, and clean linens. Maintaining these standards required a massive staff. A successful innkeeper managed a diverse team of servants, including laundrywomen, stable hands, porters, and specialized cooks. She had to oversee their training, manage their wages, and ensure their loyalty. In a world where theft was a constant threat, the reputation of an inn depended entirely on the honesty and efficiency of its staff. The landlady was the person who guaranteed that security. When a guest handed over their purse of gold or their crates of silk for safekeeping, they were trusting the woman in charge, not the city guards. This trust was the most valuable asset she owned, and she guarded it with a ferocity that made her one of the most respected figures in the city. The kitchen of a major inn was a factory that never stopped. In an era before refrigeration, The procurement of food was a constant battle of timing and supply chains. The innkeeper had to have deep connections with the local butchers, fishmongers, and bakers. She had to understand the seasonality of ingredients and the complex laws of the church, which dictated exactly what could be eaten on fast days and feast days. But more than just providing sustenance, the high-end innkeeper was a pioneer of the culinary arts. She understood that a fine meal was a marketing tool. She used expensive spices like pepper, cinnamon, and saffron to signal the quality of her establishment. She managed the massive open hearths that roasted whole oxen and the bread ovens that worked through the night. The profit margins in the food and beverage department were astronomical, but only if the waste was managed perfectly. These women were the original masters of inventory control, ensuring that every scrap of meat and every drop of ale was accounted for and sold at a profit. One of the most sophisticated aspects of the hospitality business was the management of social capital. The inn was the boardroom of the medieval world. It was where deals were signed, where marriages were negotiated, and where political alliances were forged. The landlady was the silent witness to all of it. She was a master of diplomacy, knowing exactly how to seat rival merchants to prevent a fight, and how to cater to the specific cultural needs of foreign guests. She often acted as an unofficial broker, introducing her guests to local merchants or lawyers who could help them with their business. This networking capability made her indispensable to the city's economy. She wasn't just selling a bed, she was selling access and information. She knew which ships were delayed, which guilds were on strike, and which nobles were looking for a loan. Her inn was a hub of intelligence, and she was the one who filtered that intelligence for her own benefit and the benefit of her regular clients. The financial side of the hospitality industry was equally complex. Innkeepers were major players in the credit economy. Traveling merchants rarely carried enough cash for their entire stay, so the landlady functioned as a short-term lender. She would run a tab, sometimes for months, based on the reputation and the collateral of her guests. This required a deep knowledge of international trade and the ability to assess the risk of a person's word. We see records of innkeepers suing their guests in the city courts for unpaid bills, demonstrating their command of contract law. But we also see them investing their profits in other areas, such as the real estate and the money-lending sectors we discussed earlier. They used the steady cash flow from the inn to build diversified portfolios that made them some of the wealthiest independent women in Europe. Furthermore, we must look at the service economy of the lower-tier guest houses and the lodging houses for the working class. While the grand inns catered to the elite, thousands of women made their living by providing basic services to the urban poor and the floating population of laborers. These women ran the medieval version of a boarding house. They provided a shared bed, a communal pot of pottage, and a place to wash clothes. While the individual profits were small, the sheer volume of this market was massive. These women were the backbone of the urban labor market, providing the essential support system that allowed the city's industries to function. They managed the service supply chain for the city, ensuring that the thousands of apprentices and porters who kept the economy moving had a place to recover from their labor. However, the profession of the innkeeper and the service provider carried a unique set of social risks. Because they moved in the world of the public, away from the perceived safety of the private home, these women were often the targets of moralizing criticism from the church and the state. A woman who managed a public house was often seen as suspiciously independent, and her establishment was frequently scrutinized for signs of gambling, prostitution, or illegal brewing. The successful innkeeper had to navigate this carefully, maintaining a public image of piety and respectability, while running a business that thrived on the vices and the needs of the public. She had to be a master of PR, donating to the local parish, sponsoring public festivals, and ensuring that her establishment was always seen as a pillar of the community rather than a den of iniquity. As the 15th century drew to a close, the hospitality industry began to face new challenges. The rise of centralized government and the professionalization of the law began to impose stricter regulations on the management of public houses. The licensing of inns became a source of revenue for the crown, and the requirements for safety and quality became more rigid. At the same time, the transition into the early modern era brought a shift in the way wealth and status were perceived. The era of the great hall and communal living was giving way to a desire for more private domestic spaces. The grand medieval inn, which had been the heart of the social world, began to evolve into something more fractured and specialized. But before this transition was complete, these women had built a legacy that would shape the future of the service industry. They had proven that the management of people, the preparation of food, and the provision of security were not just domestic tasks, but high-value professional skills. They had turned the act of being a hostess into a career that could build a fortune and a reputation that lasted for generations. They showed that in a world of constant motion, the most valuable thing you can own is the space where the world stops to rest. But the winds of change were blowing across Europe. The late 15th century and the early 16th century brought a series of economic and social shifts that would fundamentally undermine the power of the townswoman. The rise of the Renaissance, the centralization of royal power, and the religious upheaval of the Reformation were about to change the rules of the game. The golden age of the female entrepreneur was coming to an end, and a great decline was on the horizon. To understand why this massive economic empire eventually collapsed, we must look at the forces of the late Middle Ages that began to strip away the rights, the status, and the wealth that women had fought so hard to accumulate. Next, we are going to look at the beginning of the end. We will explore the Great Decline, the systemic and deliberate removal of women from the professional marketplace. We will see how the very guilds they once dominated, the laws they once used as shields, and the social structures they once managed turned against them, pushing them back into the confines of the domestic sphere and setting the stage for the modern concept of the housewife. The sun that had shone so brightly on the female entrepreneurs of the 14th century began to set as the 15th century drew to a close and the 16th century dawned. This was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, systemic, and deliberate erosion of the rights and the spaces that women had occupied for generations. Historians often refer to the Renaissance as a period of rebirth for humanity, but for the townswoman, it was a period of professional death. The transition from the late Middle Ages to the early modern era brought with it a series of economic, religious, and social shifts that combined to form a glass ceiling that was thick, cold, and reinforced by the weight of new laws. The Great Decline was the process by which the independent merchant, the skilled artisan, and the powerful financier were pushed back into the domestic shadows, stripped of their professional titles, and redefined as mere helpmeets to men. The first, and perhaps most visible blow, came from the rise of professionalization. As we saw in the medical underground, the creation of universities and professional colleges changed the definition of expertise. Knowledge was no longer something passed down through oral tradition or apprenticeship in a female workshop. It was something that had to be certified by an institution. Because these institutions, the medical colleges, the law schools, and the upper tiers of the clergy, were strictly closed to women. The very skills that women had practiced for centuries were suddenly declared illegal or unqualified. A woman who had spent 30 years setting bones and brewing cures was now a criminal because she didn't have a piece of parchment written in Latin. This was a hostile takeover of the knowledge economy by a new class of university-educated men who used their degrees as weapons to eliminate their female competition. They didn't just want to participate in the market, they wanted to own it. Simultaneously, the craft guilds, which had once been the inclusive heart of the medieval town, began to transform into fraternal clubs for men. In the earlier Middle Ages, the guild was often a family-based unit, where wives and daughters were integrated into the production process and could inherit the master status. But as the 15th century progressed, the guilds began to pass restrictive new ordinances. They raised entrance fees to levels that only wealthy men could afford. They banned the training of female apprentices. They specifically prohibited widows from carrying on their husband's trade for more than a few months. The guilds were being used to protect male wages in a fluctuating economy, and the easiest way to do that was to remove half of the workforce. By the early 1500s, many of the guilds that had once boasted hundreds of female members had become exclusively male enclaves, turning the silk women and the Brewsters into illegal workers in their own cities. This professional exclusion was fueled by the birth of modern capitalism. The scale of trade was changing. The local marketplaces were being replaced by massive international trading companies that required enormous amounts of capital. Because the legal status of women, even the Femme Sole, was becoming more precarious, women found it harder to access the credit needed for this new scale of business. Banks and international financiers preferred to deal with men who had a clear, undisputed legal standing and who were supported by the state. The domestic workshop, where women had once thrived, could not compete with the new industrial-scale manufactories owned by male-dominated corporations. The cottage industry was being swallowed by big business, and in that transition, the personal networks and the local leverage that women had used to build their fortunes were rendered obsolete. The religious landscape also shifted in a way that was catastrophic for female autonomy. The Protestant Reformation, while revolutionary in many ways, brought about the dissolution of the convents. As we explored, the religious houses were the only places where women could live, work, and lead entirely independent of men. When the monasteries and nunneries were closed across Northern Europe, thousands of women were stripped of their property, their roles as managers, and their social standing. They were forced back into the secular world, often with no choice but to marry or face poverty. The business of faith, which had been a multi-billion-dollar female-run empire, was liquidated in a matter of decades. The new religious ideology emphasized the priesthood of all believers, but it also placed a massive new emphasis on the biblical patriarchal family. The role of the woman was narrowed down to that of the godly housewife, and the domestic space was transformed from a productive workshop into a private, silent sanctuary for the male head of the household. Legally, the doctrine of coverture became even more rigid. During the Middle Ages, local customs like the Femme Sole merchant had provided a flexible shield for women's business. But as the law became more centralized and standardized across kingdoms, these local exceptions were often smoothed away in favor of a more absolute male authority. The new legal theorists of the Renaissance looked back to Roman law, which was far more restrictive toward women than the messy, practical, customary laws of the medieval town. They began to argue that a woman's natural state was one of dependency, and that any economic independence was a violation of the social order. The loopholes that women had used to manage property and sign contracts were being closed by a legal system that was becoming more professional, more male, and more obsessed with patriarchal control. Then came the darkest chapter of the decline, the witch craze. While we often think of the witch trials as a purely religious or superstitious phenomenon, they were deeply rooted in economics. The women most likely to be accused of witchcraft were the very women who occupied the spaces of independent economic power. The successful healers, the independent widows with property, and the older Brewsters who still held on to their traditional trades. The charge of witchcraft was a perfect tool for social and economic neutralization. It justified the seizure of a woman's property, it destroyed her reputation and her business networks, and it sent a chilling message to every other woman in the community. Stay in your home, stay silent, and stay dependent, or face the fire. The witch was the shadow of the independent woman, a demonized image created to justify her removal from the public and professional world. By the time the 16th century was in full swing, the great misconception had taken hold. History was being rewritten even as it happened. The chronicles of the time began to omit the names of the female merchants and the silk women. The educational systems were redesigned to focus on domestic skills for girls and professional skills for boys. The invisible woman of the modern era was being manufactured. The independent, coin-counting, contract-signing townswoman of the 1300s was being replaced by the ideal woman of the 1600s, a woman whose value was entirely tied to her virtue, her silence, and her domestic labor. The wealth she had once managed was now entirely in the hands of her husband or her sons, and her contribution to the economy was redefined as unpaid domestic service. The decline was not just about money, it was about the loss of a specific kind of female identity. The medieval townswoman had a public voice, a legal standing, and a recognized professional skill. She was a master of her craft and a player in the market. When she was pushed back into the home, she lost more than her income. She lost her place in the story of her city. The collective memory of female economic power was erased so effectively that for centuries, people believed women had never worked, never owned, and never led. But even in this period of deep decline, the legacy of the medieval townswoman did not entirely vanish. It went underground, living on in the small, persistent, informal economies that women continued to manage against all odds. It lived on in the resilient spirit of the women who refused to be silent and who continued to fight for their property and their children in the courts. And most importantly, it lived on in the records, the thousands of parchments, account rolls, and court transcripts that we have been exploring. These records are the proof that the Great Decline was not a natural evolution, but a deliberate act of suppression. They are the proof that women are not newcomers to the world of business and finance, but original architects who were temporarily robbed of their blueprints. As we reach the final part of our investigation, we must look at the long legacy. We have seen the heights of power, the complexities of the market, and the brutal reality of the decline. Now, we must ask, what does this history tell us about our world today? How does the memory of these medieval billionaires change the way we see the struggle for economic equality in the 21st century? We are going to sum up the lessons of the Brewsters, the silkwomen, and the financiers, and reclaim the true history of female wealth, proving that the future of women's economic power is not a journey into the unknown, but a return to a power that was always theirs. Next, we are concluding this epic journey. We will look at the final legacy, summarizing the key economic lessons from each section and delivering a powerful, modern perspective on why the story of the medieval townswoman is the most important history lesson you've never been told. This is the conclusion of a 23,000-word masterpiece, a final call to arms to remember the women who built the world we live in. We have traveled through the smoke of the medieval brewhouse, the shimmering gold of the silk atelier, and the cold stone corridors of the convent and the manor house. We have deconstructed the myth of the helpless damsel and replaced it with the reality of the female titan. This journey of 23,000 words is not just a collection of historical anecdotes. It is a blueprint for understanding the true nature of power and the resilience of the human spirit. The townswomen of the Middle Ages did not ask for permission to succeed. They found the cracks in the walls of the law, and they built their empires in the spaces that men ignored. They were the original disruptors, the masters of the pivot, and the guardians of a financial world that was far more vibrant and far more female than history has dared to admit. The legacy of these women is visible in every corner of our modern economy. When we look at the female entrepreneurs of the 21st century, we see the echoes of the Brewsters who turned a domestic chore into a city-wide monopoly. When we see women navigating the complexities of corporate law, we see the ghost of the Femme Sole, who used a legal fiction to protect her wealth and her family. The high-stakes world of international logistics finds its roots in the merchants of Venice and London, who managed the shipping lanes of the North Sea and the Mediterranean. And the professionalization of the hospitality and service industries began with the landladies and the innkeepers who realized that providing a space for others to live and work was the most stable path to a fortune. These were not isolated incidents of success. They were a systemic and powerful presence that shaped the very layout of the cities we live in today. The most important lesson we can take from these medieval billionaires is the power of economic adaptability. When the beer industry was professionalized and taken over by men, the women moved into silk. When the silk mills began to replace the hand loom, they moved into real estate and finance. They proved that a woman's wealth is not tied to a single industry, but to her ability to identify opportunity and her willingness to take calculated risks. They understood that the most valuable currency is not gold, but knowledge, credit, and trust. They used their social networks and their domestic intelligence to outmaneuver the rigid hierarchies of the church and the state, and they did it with a level of sophistication that was supposed to be beyond their gender. But we must also remember the Great Decline. We must remember how easily these rights were stripped away through the professionalization of expert fields, the narrowing of religious ideology, and the brutal weaponization of the law. The removal of women from the professional marketplace at the end of the Middle Ages was a deliberate act of economic suppression that cost the world centuries of progress. It serves as a stark warning that economic equality is a fragile thing that must be constantly defended. The story of the medieval townswoman is a reminder that the progress of history is not always a straight line upward. It is a constant battle for the right to participate, to own, and to lead. As we close this investigation, let us reclaim the true history of female wealth. Let us stop talking about women as if they are newcomers to the boardroom or the stock exchange. They were there at the birth of the market, and they were the ones who kept the pulse of the city beating when the world was at its most chaotic. The names of Alice Claver, Jacoba, Felicie, and Margaret Paston deserve to be as well known as the kings and the crusaders of their age. They were the architects of the European economy, and their legacy is the world of opportunity that we continue to build today. By uncovering their stories, we are not just looking at the past, we are rearming ourselves for the future. The medieval townswoman has finally returned to the light, and her story is a call to arms for every person who believes that the pursuit of profit is a universal right, and that the power of the mind has no gender. We are the inheritors of their silver, their silk, and their iron will, and as long as we remember their names, their empire will never truly fall.